Mr. President, I'm so grateful for the remarks of my colleague and friend from the great state of Massachusetts and for his voice on this very important issue. I rise today as a child of the civil rights movement, as the blessed beneficiary of its bold moral witness in America, and as a member of only the second generation of our nation to have full and fair access to the right to vote. Some have argued that in a real sense, our country did not really become a democracy until 1965, when there were those who stood up with courage and challenged the nation to live up to its ideals. I stand here today and I'm able to work in this building on behalf of the people of Georgia. What an honor to represent 11 million people, to carry on this grand experiment called democracy. But it's never far from my memory that at the time of my birth, Georgia's two senators were Richard B. Russell and Herman E. Talmadge. In many ways, they were effective. They brought great things back to the state of Georgia, but we would not be honest. We would not be telling the full story if we did not remember that they were both arch segregationists and unabashed adversaries of the civil rights movement, which sought to expand the electorate, to ensure that this is a house where every American citizen has a voice. Senator Talmadge once said, "We love the Negro in his place, and his place is at the back door." Well, it is a testament to the greatness of this country that I sit in his seat, because there were those who stood up to fight for the highest ideals of our country. I reference that history because it is relevant in this moment. Nearly 62 years ago to the day, those two Georgia senators, along with other Southern senators, began a weeks-long effort to prevent people who look like me and my parents and my children from fully participating in our democracy. They were trying to narrow the electorate. And so I find it interesting and ironic that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have been leading this effort dared in recent days to reference this very history, which is the cause for my being here in the first place. One of them pointed out the fact that when we entered the debate about the civil rights legislation and trying to push it into law, that there were those who stood up day after day, week after week. And he dared to enlist that history as if somehow that was some inspiration for what they are trying to do in this moment. Let me be very clear. You are on the other side of that history. You're on the side of those who are trying to narrow the electorate. And so if you want to pass the SAVE Act, that is your prerogative. If you want to argue that folks have to have a birth certificate or a passport just to be able to register to vote in a country where most Americans do not have a passport. If you want to effectively disenfranchise women, disenfranchise poor people, working class people who have to struggle for the right to vote, that is your prerogative. But be very clear, you are not on the side of the movement, you're on the other side of that history. Fight for this if you will. But you ought to leave the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr.'s name out of your mouth. This country goes through moments where the electorate expands, and then it goes through moments when it contracts, and we are in a contraction moment. We're in a moment where, in the words of the administration itself, it was a cabinet official in the White House herself who said that we just want to make sure that, quote, the right people are voting. The right people. The right people are voting. That was the argument in the 1960s. And had those who wanted to make sure that the, quote, right people were voting, had they prevailed, I would not be standing here today. I don't believe in the right people. I believe in we the people. We the people. We the people. That is not just the first three words of our charter document. It is a creed. We the people. Every American citizen must have access to the franchise, and it must not be treated as a privilege. It is a right. And when you put up unnecessary barriers, you undermine that basic understanding that the franchise is not a privilege, it's a right. I often say that a vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire for ourselves and for our children. And our prayers are stronger when we pray together. There are no right or wrong people. There's only the American people. And they put up this SAVE Act arguing that they want to make sure that it's only Americans who are voting, but they have demonstrated, they have provided no evidence that voter fraud is a real thing through voter identification. We know that this will disenfranchise thousands, if not millions, of Americans. We have no evidence that this is a problem that actually needs to be solved, and yet they have shut down much of the business of the Senate in order to do this. They are hell-bent on getting this done. Donald Trump said that this is his number one priority, and so it begs the question, why is this his number one priority? With all the things going on in our country, why is this the main thing that he feels he must get done? Why is he afraid? I'll tell you why. It's because that he knows that he has broken every promise he made. He said that he was going to lower your costs. Instead, he's doubled health care premiums for 22 million Americans. His tariffs have cost the average family over $1,000 a year. Gas prices are spiking and show no sign of coming down anytime soon, but this is his number one priority. He said he was going to be the president of peace, but he has attacked 17 countries and counting. And yet again, we find ourselves entangled in another endless war with no end game and no idea of what victory even looks like. All the while, we have important problems right here at home. Donald Trump promised to support our farmers, and instead he's raised the cost of fertilizer and hamstrung their exports. And farmers all across Georgia are suffering as a result. And so that's really what this is all about. Donald Trump is a failed president, and his support is collapsing. I hear it all across Georgia, in rural towns bearing the brunt of the president's immigration policies and farmers dealing with the realities of a trade war. This president claims to be America first, but in the name of protecting United States citizens, his deportation machine has seized over 170 citizens. They've shot and killed 2 American citizens on a quiet street. I went to stand where they lost their lives. In a real sense, I felt like I was standing on holy ground. Ground made sacred by the blood of patriots who stood up against abusive authority under the color of law. To remind us that at the end of the day, this is our country. We the people. We the people. Not the powerful interests who can write big checks to keep politicians in office, we the people. Not the lobbyists, we the people. Not the American oligarchs, we the people. And now they want to prevent even more citizens from voting, from making our voices heard. They want to block our ability to stand up in November and say, enough is enough. And so the president is panicking. He's doing what he always does. He's attacking our elections so that you cannot fire his foot soldiers in Congress. It is pathetic. He looks to me like a scared human being who knows that behind the curtain is a tiny man. We will not be intimidated. Our voices will not be silenced. The president continues to push the lies that he spread after he lost in 2020 to create the pretext to interfere in the midterm elections. That's why we saw an FBI raid in Fulton County, Georgia. And as I watched that FBI raid, I saw the director of national intelligence crouched in a corner, talking on a mobile phone. And I wondered, why was she there? There were bomb threats in polling stations in poor and black neighborhoods during the 2024 election, which was later traced back to Russian interference. Still waiting on an answer from her on that. There she was, engaged in this effort to count the ballots again in the 2020 election, even after the president's own Justice Department found no evidence of meaningful voter fraud. These claims about voter fraud, that's the fraud. That's the fraud. And I think Americans are growing tired of it. You know, the wonderful thing about our country, Mr. President, is that we get to have the argument. You and I don't agree on a whole range of things, but I just want us to be able to have the argument. It gets rambunctious in the American public square to avoid violence. But at the end of the day, Everybody gets to go to the polls. And the most powerful words in a democracy are "the people have spoken." And so I will always cast my lot on the side of democracy. I'm hopeless in this regard. I believe in the people. I want to make sure my constituents' voices are heard, all of my constituents, even when they don't agree with me, even when I don't get the outcome that I want. When I think about the nature of human power and human pride, and forgive me, but I'm a preacher after all, human sin, our desire to make sure that we slant things so that we get the outcome we want. We see it not just in governments, you see it in your own family. The question becomes, how do you balance all of those things? I think democracy is the best we've got. Given who we are as human beings, I will cast my lot with the people's voice. Even when I think they've gotten it wrong, I would rather put my trust there. Reinhold Niebuhr perhaps put it best. He said that humankind's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Our capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. At the end of the day, the thing that can fix it, whatever issue we have, I believe is the people's voice. And so I'm disturbed about what I'm witnessing. I'm disturbed about an attack on Fulton County and in Maricopa County, Arizona. It troubles me when ICE lands in Minneapolis and then the administration says that we are there to deal with violent criminals, we are there to deal with this immigration issue. But then when it comes down to it, the administration says, do you really want ICE out of your community? Hand over your voter rolls. Come on, man. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican. Come on, you can see what this is about. What do the voter rolls have to do with violent criminals? What kind of ransom note is that to send to the leaders of the people of Minneapolis? And so the big lie continues to live. And we need to kill it once and for all. And the only thing that can do that is the people's voice. The president continues to spread conspiracy theories and outright lies. Here's the reality. This bill will disenfranchise thousands, if not millions, of Americans. And that is why they want to pass it so desperately. They are using onerous citizenship verification as a pretext for voter suppression, requiring you to use a birth certificate or a passport to register to vote. And under this bill, a driver's license wouldn't be enough to register to vote. They ought to call the bill what it is. They ought to call it a driver's license is not good enough act. They call it the SAVE Act, but the question is, what are they trying to save? They are not trying to save our elections. They are trying to save their own power at any cost. At the cost of the voices of ordinary people. Let's think about this in practical terms. If you change addresses, even if you move down the street, and you've been voting for years. Do you want to have to track down your birth certificate, which you lost while you were moving, in order to register to vote? You get married and you change your name. You got to go find your marriage license and a birth certificate or a passport to prove that you are a citizen. More than half of Georgians, or 5.4 million people, lack a valid passport. And as many as 2.2 million women in Georgia may not have a birth certificate that matches their current legal name. And so women are disproportionately disenfranchised by this piece of legislation, which again is a solution in search of a problem that does not exist. Let me be really clear. Non-citizens should never vote in our elections. There's no argument about that. But this legislation will only make it harder for eligible American voters to make their voices heard. That is the actual work that this legislation will do. We know that about 760,000 voting-age Georgians who are United States citizens would have difficulty showing documentation proving their citizenship. We know that. By the way, we have voter ID in Georgia. And I will tell you for the record that I think you should have to prove that you are who you say you are before you vote. I support voter ID. We have voter ID laws in my state. You should have to prove that you are who you say you are before you vote. That's basic, but that is not what this is about. This is about onerous voter ID requirements used as a pretext and as a tool for voter suppression. Because there are those in the administration who want to make sure, quote, the right people vote. There are currently strong laws on the books that keep non-citizens from voting. They face criminal prosecution and deportation if they vote. So let's just think about the risk-reward analysis, the cost-benefit analysis. You will be criminally prosecuted if you try to vote and you are not a citizen. And you're trying to tell me that folks will risk criminal prosecution in droves to change the potential outcome of an election? Are you trying to tell me that folk will try to vote twice? It's hard enough to get folks to vote once, let alone twice. And that's probably why Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger found only 20 instances of non-citizens registered out of 8.2 million in Georgia. 8.2 million people registered to vote in Georgia. The Republican Secretary of State found 20 instances of non-citizens who were registered, and only 9 had ever attempted to vote. And the majority did so before 2012. This is a solution in search of a problem that does not exist. And so this means that the, quote, Save America Act would burden or disenfranchise over 150,000 Georgians for every single instance of a non-citizen voting in the last decade. Does that make sense? You keep one non-citizen from voting, you disenfranchise 150,000 for everyone? You're trying to tell me that that makes the democracy stronger? More representative of our interests? And so if there's no meaningful voter fraud, and if this law is so disastrous for voting citizens, the question is, why is the president so desperate to sign the Save America Act into law? And I mean, he's desperate. So desperate that he's threatened his own Republican caucus, said, if y'all don't do this, we're not going to do anything. The president is trying to take away your right to vote so he can hold on to power. And Washington Republicans are trying to help him do it. They're using the Save America Act as a pretext for voter suppression. They know their policies are deeply unpopular with the American people, but instead of working to change their policies, instead of working to get more people access to the health care that they need, they're taking health care away from 15 million Americans. Instead of working to lower the cost of groceries, they're instituting reckless tariff taxes that make everything more expensive. Instead of actually working on behalf of the American people, they're working to change who can vote in the next election. And so we're going to stand up. I'm certainly going to stand up for all of my constituents. And I mean that. I want the Georgians who are in red districts to know that I'm fighting for you and your voice. Because this administration's so-called Save America Act will disenfranchise many of my constituents in red districts. And that is because increasingly the people's voices are being squeezed out of their democracy. It is the folks with a lot of money. It is the corporate interests that they want to hear from. And you're living right now with what happens when your voice is diminished. I see it. I see it in rural red counties that I visit all the time, where their rural hospital is either closed or it's almost near closing. Because they cut $1 trillion out of Medicaid. I see it in the eyes of farmers who are burdened by these tariff taxes and how it's creating damage and wreckage for their businesses. I saw it the other day in Social Circle, Georgia, where the administration is determined to put a 10,000 bed ICE detention center in a town of 5,000 people. 5,000 people in Social Circle, Georgia. The administration went in, bought a warehouse for $128 million. And the The city manager, the leadership of Social Circle Georgia, learned that there would be a detention center in their town that would triple the size of their town by reading about it in the Washington Post. So think about that. The mayor elected to represent his people. The big bad federal government comes in under cover of night and ambushes the duly elected local officials because they didn't want to hear their voice. They were determined to bring this warehouse to their town whether they like it or not. And so I'm fighting for those people. Even though it's by and large a red district, I don't have a lot of votes in Social Circle Georgia, but I'm a pastor first. And I told the people of Georgia that I would fight for them, that I would walk with them even as I work for them. And so this is about the voices of ordinary people. This is about saving our democracy. As I close, and nobody believes a Baptist preacher when he says, as I close. But I'm not trying to break any records today. Andrew Young tells me the story that when they passed the Civil Rights Bill into law, Dr. King and his lieutenants went to see President Johnson. And the president was feeling good, and he should. They'd passed the Civil Rights Bill into law after that long filibuster that I talked about at the beginning of this speech. They passed the Civil Rights Bill into law, and Dr. King and his lieutenants went to see the president. And Dr. King said, I'm glad we got that Civil Rights Bill into law. And without skipping a beat, he said, now we need a voting rights law. He wasn't going to let the president bask too long in the glory of that victory. He said, that's great, but my people can't vote in the South. I need a voting rights law, and I need it yesterday. The president said to Martin Luther King Jr., you're right, I get it, but I just can't get that done right now. I don't have the power. And they left the meeting, and the staff was feeling all demoralized and dejected, and they said to Dr. King, what are we going to do? The president said, he doesn't have the power. Dr. King just sort of shrugged his shoulder and said, well, if the president doesn't have the power, I guess we're going to have to go and find him some. Think about that. He's just a Baptist preacher, wasn't elected to anything. He was not a United States senator, certainly not the president of the United States. But he said, we're going to go and find the president some power. Dr. King understood, and those who were around him understood, that it's not about the people in power, it's about the power that's in the people. And so the people are standing up in this moment, and I'm standing with them. No to the so-called SAVE Act, yes to saving our democracy. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I think we should set the scene very clearly that during the last 2 weeks since we voted on the War Powers Resolution led in a bipartisan manner by Senators Kaine and Paul, the Trump administration's unconstitutional war with Iran has evolved tremendously. In the span of just 2 weeks, 13 U.S. service members have been killed, and at least 200 of our American men and women have been injured. U.S. diplomatic posts and military facilities in the Middle East are under constant attack. The war has expanded, now impacting at least 15 different countries, from the basis of our European allies to our allies in the region. American citizens are still 2 weeks in, stranded in the region, trying to get home. civilian casualties are increasing. And here at home, we are seeing the skyrocketing costs of basic goods, the skyrocketing costs of energy, and the skyrocketing costs we're seeing at the pumps at our gas stations. We now know the Trump administration is spending over $1 billion a day on this unauthorized war, while Americans are struggling to make ends meet here at home, and this president is throwing millions of people off of their health care. And this administration, amidst all of this, has failed to come before the United States Senate and the American people for public hearings to make its case on the biggest military war engagement since the war in Afghanistan. Now, all of us, all 100, swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States of America. Well, fealty to that oath is clear because the Constitution is clear. Congress has the authority to declare war and authorize the use of military force. But in this case, Congress and the United States Senate in particular has done nothing. The Senate has a solemn responsibility to assert itself along the constitutional mandate in matters of war and peace. This is why I urge my colleagues soon to support the motion to discharge Senate Joint Resolution 118. I ask for that because of what is at stake: billions of American taxpayer dollars, hundreds of American lives. What is at stake is the Constitution of the United States of America. We swore an oath. We have an obligation. This is the moment now. This is not left or right. This is a moral moment and a solemn, sacred, patriotic duty to uphold the Constitution, especially when the President of the United States of America is so willfully violating it. Mr. President, I yield.
I rise today not only as a senator, but as an American and as a descendant of enslaved men and women like those who built this chamber and fought hard for the right to vote. I rise today with a deep concern that we are balancing on a knife's edge, and that if the Save America Act becomes law, we will undercut one of the most fundamental things that makes America America: the right to vote. Now, we are literally in the midst of elections right now, and it's my understanding that this bill would actually take effect immediately. And we've got Americans who are concerned about the cost of living, everything from their rent now to their energy costs. We are in the midst of war. And we know as a country we have the most safe and secure elections in the world. So to my colleagues, I ask the question, what are you saving us from? Being able to participate in our democracy? We've been down this road before. Mr. President, behind me is a copy of a document that my sister Thea found when researching our family roots. We turned this into a scarf that I carried with me on the day that I was sworn in to the United States House of Representatives in 2017, because it was a historic moment and I wanted to carry history with me. And again, I carried it with me when I was sworn in to this august body, the United States Senate. This document is a window into our nation's and my family's history. It captures the moment when my great-great-great-grandfather, a formerly enslaved man, gained the right to vote. He couldn't read or write, so he signed his returns of qualified voters and Reconstruction oath with an X. I've been reflecting on this document and how it relates to the moment that we are in as a nation, how it's a physical manifestation of our democracy's ability to expand and contract, how we can bring people together and how we can separate. It's a part of the American experiment. Yet 159 years after my great-great-great-grandfather signed this document and gained his right to vote, and 61 years after President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, protecting that fundamental right and expanding it for Black women, we in the Senate are debating the possibility of placing burdens and barriers on voting for millions of Americans, a contraction of our democracy. We, in a few months, we're just a few months from marking our nation's 250th year, months away from acknowledging how far we have come as a country. But it's my belief that our democracy is under attack, that there is a coordinated effort to undermine voting rights in America, from right here in Congress to the judiciary to the executive. Let's start with the reason that we're here today, the Save America Act. This bill is as dangerous as it is unethical. It is a thinly veiled attempt to make it harder for some Americans to participate in our democracy. So here's what it does. It enables this administration to supercharge their voter roll purges by forcing states to share their voter lists with the federal government. It would end proven and safe voter registration systems, including online and mail registration. It would impose new costs on Americans who want to vote, creating a modern-day poll tax. It would undermine voting by mail, and it would criminalize election workers and more. Our distinguished minority leader called this bill Jim Crow 2.0. I'm calling it Jim Crow 2.0. Here it is by the numbers: 146 million, 165, 69, and 4.5. 146 million is the number of Americans who don't have passports at this moment. So unless they can prove their citizenship with their birth certificate or Social Security card, those millions of Americans will not be able to vote. 165 is the base price for getting a brand new passport. If you have a passport and it's expiring, it will cost you $130 to renew. So if you can't find your birth certificate or Social Security card, there is now a price tag on your access to the ballot. 69 million is the number of women who have changed their names. Not only will they have to provide proof of citizenship, but under this bill, they also would have to bring their marriage certificate to a voting booth or maybe a signed affidavit from a judge proving their name change. 4.5. 4.5 hours is the average amount of time a rural voter would have to drive round trip to prove they are a citizen and ensure that they can vote in the next election. My colleagues will have you believe that we don't believe IDs are important. That's not the case. It's just not true. Many states are already across the country. We have to use our IDs to vote. I took my driver's license with me when I voted recently in a local election. That's not the point of this bill. The point of this bill is trying to solve a problem that's not there. And in doing so, it moves the goalposts for people who want to vote. It will squeeze people out of the democratic process by finding ways to cost you money and cost you time if you want to vote. Bottom line, if this bill passes, our driver's license, real ID, tribal ID, college IDs for students, military IDs will no longer be enough. If this bill passes, you would have to mail in a photocopy of your proof of citizenship with your ballot, making it exponentially harder for Americans to vote by mail, not to mention undermining privacy. If you're married, if you are in a rural community, if you are a student on a college campus, if you are a person with a disability, if you are a senior, or if you have changed your name at any point in your life, like so many of us have, including myself. I was married, I was divorced, I was widowed. This bill won't save you, it will hurt you. But this is just one aspect of the current attack on voting rights. The second comes from across the street, where the Supreme Court has been chipping and chipping and chipping away at voting rights. The systematic weakening of our voter protections started decades ago, when the Supreme Court undermined the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA. Pre-clearance required jurisdictions with a historical record of racial discrimination in voting to clear any changes to their voting laws with the federal government. This was a backstop that protected access to the ballot box for many voters of color. Once it was struck down, some states began to take advantage, passing restrictive voting ID laws, restricting voter registration timeframes, reducing early voting, and more. In 2021, the Supreme Court made it harder to prove racially discriminatory voting practices under the VRA. And later this year, they will hear a case that would make it even harder for minority communities to sue states for discriminatory congressional maps. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the threat to our democracy that comes from the executive branch. Let me start from the beginning. Since January of 2025, the Trump administration has used DOJ to steal our personal information and data. They pulled information from Social Security Administration and the IRS. Why? Maybe to track the American people. Now the administration has turned their attention toward establishing an unsanctioned nationwide voter database. They also raided a Georgia voting center under false pretenses, undermined access to mail-in ballots by changing the rules around how mail is postmarked, and sued and threatened states like Minnesota over access to their voter files. All of this from a president that wants to, quote, take over the voting, quote, unquote, so that the GOP, quote, will never lose a race for 50 years, end quote. This is a coordinated and un-American campaign against the very core of who we are as a nation. And it's not something that I say lightly, but it's something that I believe must be said, especially as we approach the 250th anniversary of our country. In those 250 years, we have seen our democracy expand and contract multiple times. Our democracy expanded when my great-great-great-grandfather signed his name with that X and gained the right to vote. His descendant now stands in the Senate, a living reminder that our democracy has the ability to grow and change. But our democracy has contracted too. And we need to learn from that past if we're going to prevent further contraction in the future. Mr. President, I fear we're on the cusp of falling into a trap our ancestors sprung 100 years ago. You see, my great-great-great-grandfather earned the right to vote in Georgia with his signature, but it's unlikely that he was able to really exercise that newly won right for very long. Because from 1877 to 1901, while some Americans were enjoying the Gilded Age, Black Americans were living through a period known as the Great Nadir. If apex is the highest, the nadir is the lowest. Voter suppression, political violence, things that you see and feel even now. Many of the rights enumerated in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, including the right to vote, were being eroded, washed away by partisan gerrymandering, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, Jim Crow laws, and even Supreme Court decisions. For decades, civil rights leaders fought not just to achieve new rights, but to reinstate the ones lost. Our democracy has expanded and contracted. The first Black Senator, Hiram Revels, was elected to Congress in 1870, and then Blanche Bruce. But it was 86 years between those two senators and 1967 when we had the next black senator. 86 years. Right now, there are 5 of us. And this is the first time in our history where there are 2 black women at the same time. If the Save America Act passes, we are on the verge of another contraction. The parallels with the Great Nadir are as stark as they are many. Once again, laws are being proposed to strip us from the access to the ballot box. Once again, the Supreme Court is postured to send us backwards rather than protecting the path forward. And once again, voting rights are under attack by the federal government. I look around this room and I know that we have a choice to make. Whether we'll allow partisan divides to enable the backsliding of our democracy, or if we're willing to stand shoulder to shoulder to protect the bedrock of our nation, the right to vote. So what can we do? First, we must block the Save America Act from advancing any further. As senators, we have a responsibility to call it as we see it and to conduct oversight and expose executive overreach. And that's what this bill is, executive overreach, that would undermine our right to vote across this country. As Democratic senators, we plan to stand in its path, and I hope that some of my Republican colleagues will join us. And to all of those watching at home, I want you to know there is strength in numbers, that your power lies in being educated and informed and organized and mobilizing. And in this moment, I stand here and say no to Jim Crow 2.0. I yield.
Thank you. It is unfortunate that we're here today to debate the merits of this so-called Save America Act. Right now, Americans are struggling with the rising cost of housing, health care, gas, groceries, and more. Earlier this week in Maryland, the average price of gas shot up 14 cents overnight. The American people are suffering from the effects of a trade war started by this administration and now watching as we're stuck in an illegal and poorly planned military war in Iran. This increasing unaffordability is an urgent crisis that actually demands a resolution. But unfortunately, we have an administration that is completely out of touch. There are so many real issues that we could be working on that would actually benefit the lives of working families across our country. But we're here, ignoring their wishes and debating this legislation because this president isn't living in reality. He has created a fantasy crisis and is committed to finding a solution to a problem that does not exist. So my colleagues are here making arguments that don't hold up under any real scrutiny, claiming that this bill is necessary to ensure that only U.S. citizens vote in American elections. But reality says that non-citizen voting in federal elections is already against the law, and there are enforcement mechanisms in place. This is the law, and it should be followed. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle disingenuously claim that this bill is a common-sense election integrity measure focused on proof of citizenship, voter ID, and cleaner voting rolls. Reality says that on top of everything else that people are dealing with right now, requiring even more paperwork would create real problems for so many people, like married women whose documents don't match because they changed their names to match their husbands, or members of our military who move locations often in service of our country. It would be a problem for people who rely on mail registration or absentee voting. It would be an undue burden for our seniors, veterans, students, and rural voters. Voting already requires a form of American identification. And so my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say that this bill would provide necessary aggressive voter roll verification and removal of non-citizens from the rolls. Reality says that this aggressive federal overreach would include requiring states to submit voter data to DHS, the same organization that is currently sending ICE goon squads of men with masks on to kill Americans in our streets. States would be required to submit their complete statewide voter registration list to DHS for comparison through the, quote, SAVE program on an ongoing basis. That is completely impractical. The SAVE program was not designed to be a voter registration system, and it predictably has resulted in false matches and false ineligibility flags. What's more, it gives DHS a continuing role in federal elections that it's not equipped or designed to handle. It hands over critical information to an administration that I would dare say has already proven that it is not trustworthy and that it cannot or will not keep the sensitive data of the American people protected. It hands over information to an administration that has already failed this very basic test of using its power for retribution. Reality says this is being treated as an emergency right now, and we understand why, because it's a part of a broader electoral strategy that this administration needs to be in place ahead of the upcoming midterm elections. People are unhappy with the direction that our country is going in right now. They're upset that their government isn't working on the real issues that they're facing. And instead of addressing the affordability crisis that is staring us in the face, the affordability crisis that was caused by this president, this administration wants to guarantee a successful midterm election by, quote, fixing an electoral system that is not broken. The president already issued an executive order directing federal agencies to be more involved in an election-related enforcement and citizen verification. And since then, the DOJ has sought extensive voter data from nearly every state. At least 48 states and D.C. have received requests for their complete voter registration lists, and the DOJ has sued D.C. and 29 states, including Maryland, for refusing to provide statewide voter lists with driver's license and Social Security information. And this administration is counting on Republicans in Congress to sell their sick fantasy. And that's why we're here now, wasting precious time trying to fix a problem that is not real. But reality has refuted every single fantasy claim made in support of this bill. So what are the architects of this bill actually seeking? Well, simply put, they're seeking to suppress the vote. This is not a standard voter ID bill. This bill is not about protecting democracy. Protecting democracy would eliminate barriers that keep more Americans from voting. This bill does not do that. It does the opposite. This bill is a blatant attempt to kick eligible American voters off the rolls and make it more complicated for Americans to register and vote. States have already done an excellent job fashioning a system that works. In the fantasy world that this bill envisions would disrupt the way voter registration and voting actually work in practice. It would undermine or severely limit online registration, registration by mail, motor voter systems, same-day registration, and voter registration drives by requiring in-person presentation of documentary proof. It would alter registration, list maintenance, and ballot casting all at once, forcing states and election officials to rework systems that voters already rely on. My home state of Maryland has worked hard to build a system that is both secure and accessible. And this bill would undermine the progress that we and so many other states have made by replacing those successful, efficient undermine the progress that we and so many other states have made by replacing those successful, efficient state systems with new federal mandates and new legal risks for elections officials. It would result in wrongful removals from voter rolls and more undue burdens, putting new barriers between eligible voters and the ballot box. Now, if the president and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to ignore the urgent crisis facing the nation in order to fix issues with voting that actually do exist, they would endorse the bill that I have introduced, the Deceptive Practices in Voter Intimidation Prevention Act, that would criminalize knowingly spreading false information about the time, place, or manner of voting, or about voter qualifications, and would prohibit threatening or coercing individuals not to vote or to vote in a certain way. But that would require my colleagues to actually care about our democracy. They would sign on to the numerous bills by my colleagues that I have co-sponsored, like Senator Klobuchar's Register America to Vote Act, that would automatically register all eligible citizens to vote when they turn 18. But this, too, would require my colleagues to actually care about our democracy. They would sign on to Senator Wyden's Vote at Home Act that would expand vote by mail, a method that has proven to increase voter participation, yet that would require my colleagues to care about our democracy. They would sign on to Senator Padilla's Voter Purge Protection Act that would prohibit states from using questionable voter purge tactics to take tens of thousands of eligible voters off the voting rolls. But that, too, would require my colleagues to care about democracy. If they truly cared about democracy, they would have already signed on to the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would restore the safeguards of the Voting Rights Act that was so short-sightedly gutted by the Supreme Court. John Lewis lived through some of this nation's most challenging times. His reality was seeing poll taxes and literacy tests disenfranchise thousands, harassment and death threats for trying to register voters, violent attacks for peacefully protesting. His reality was bravely standing up to hate, knowing that fighting for the right to vote was worth the blood he shed on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That very real crisis was met by the passing of the landmark Voting Rights Act, so instrumental to this nation's progress that through everything he faced in his life, John Lewis said that his greatest fear is that one day we may wake up and our democracy is gone. You know, I walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge last summer. It's something that I recommend that all who have the ability to do will do, so that especially the young people of our country will understand truly what has been put on the line in order for us to have the right to vote. It wasn't lost on me as I walked across that bridge and recognized that, to be honest with you, very similar to these goons running across our country, these ICE agents in masks, these were people who were essentially deputized to traumatize American citizens. And so the men who were on the other side of that Edmund Pettus Bridge were waiting for these young people. John Lewis was 22 years old when he took up this battle, walked across that bridge, and these people who were not even truly law enforcement officials had sticks that were wrapped in barbed wire. Can you imagine the character or the manner of a person who's capable of beating another human with a stick that was wrapped in barbed wire? But that's how strongly these people felt about depriving people of the right to vote. They beat him within an inch of his life because they did not want to give African Americans the right to vote. So this bill would take real steps toward creating another crisis, a crisis that was John Lewis's greatest fear. America has a long, detailed history of people fighting, bleeding, and dying to secure the right to vote. That hard-won freedom to speak with your vote should not depend on whether you have the time, money, or flexibility to satisfy a new set of hurdles that go to serve this administration's goals. And I would say that those goals are intellectually dishonest goals, and they are not reality. You don't save America by silencing the voices of Americans. I'll repeat that. There is no way to save America by silencing the voices of Americans. You save America by embracing the ideals that set us apart to begin with. The reality is that we should be encouraging more people to take full advantage of their rights. That's why we should be making it easier for eligible citizens to participate in our democracy, not harder. When a bill takes a fundamental right and wraps it in paperwork, penalties, and confusion, that is not election security. That is a step backwards for American democracy. And that's not what the American people want. They did not ask for an additional crisis to deal with. This administration has insisted on ignoring their calls for help on the affordability crisis, but maybe listening to their objections to this bill will open their eyes. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.